Living a lie is easy when no one asks the right questions. For 15 years, the performance was flawless, until the day a child's innocent words cracked everything open. What began as a quiet unraveling ended with something far more terrifying and beautiful. Finally being seen for who had been hiding all along. I spent 15 years of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't, building a marriage and career on a foundation of silence. When my childhood trauma resurfaced through my daughter's innocent questions, the walls I'd constructed began to crumble. My spouse never knew the real me. How could they when I'd buried that person so deep? I barely remembered her myself. The day I finally broke down and revealed everything, I expected to lose it all. Instead, I found that the truth, however painful, created space for something I never thought possible, the chance to finally become whole. I became an expert at playing a role before I even understood what acting was. By age 7, I knew exactly which version of myself to present in any situation. The quiet, well-behaved daughter at home. The bubbly, friendly child at school. The serious, focused student in class. These weren't choices. They were survival mechanisms. When you grow up in a household where emotions are dangerous things, where sadness is met with dismissal, anger with punishment, and fear with impatience, you learn to compartmentalize quickly. My parents weren't monsters. I need to make that clear. They provided for my physical needs, made sure I was educated, clothed, and fed. But emotionally, our home was a desert. Looking back now, I can see they were simply replicating the emotional neglect they'd experienced in their own childhoods. The cycle continued through me, though I wouldn't recognize it for decades. By high school, I'd perfected my performance. I was the supportive friend, the dedicated student, the respectful daughter. I collected achievements like armor, honor roll, volunteer work, leadership positions in clubs. Each accomplishment was another brick in the wall between my external self and whatever lay beneath. I never questioned who I actually was beneath all those roles. I never wondered what I might want if I weren't so focused on being what everyone else needed. College brought freedom, but also terror. Without the familiar structures of home and high school, I felt my carefully constructed identity beginning to slip. So I doubled down, finding new roles to play. The diligent pre-med student, because my parents valued stability and status. The reliable roommate, the organized study group leader. Dating was terrifying because it threatened to expose the emptiness at my core, so I kept relationships superficial until my junior year. That's when I met my future spouse. They were everything I wasn't: authentic, emotionally expressive, comfortable in their own skin. I was drawn to their genuineness like a moth to flame. Maybe I thought their light could somehow illuminate the darkness inside me. Maybe I believed that by attaching myself to someone so real, I could become real too. Our courtship was a contradiction. I was simultaneously more myself with them than with anyone else, yet still fundamentally performing. I showed the parts of me I thought were acceptable: my intelligence, my work ethic, my capacity for care and concern. I mimicked their emotional openness while keeping my deepest truths locked away. And they fell in love with this carefully curated version of me. After graduation, we moved in together. Marriage followed 2 years later. I remember standing at the altar, hearing myself promise to love and honor them, while a voice deep inside whispered, "They don't even know who they're marrying." But I silenced that voice, as I'd been doing my entire life. I convinced myself that the person I presented was close enough to whoever I might authentically be. I told myself that everyone has secrets, that no one is completely transparent with their partner. My career followed the same pattern. I excelled in healthcare administration, a field I'd chosen because it made practical sense, not because it spoke to any particular passion. I learned to project confidence in meetings, to speak with authority on topics I'd only just researched, to navigate office politics with diplomatic skill. My colleagues described me as put together, level-headed, unflappable. These weren't compliments. They were confirmations of my successful disguise. Home became another stage for my performance. I played the role of devoted spouse, creating a life that looked perfect from the outside: weekend brunches, dinner parties with friends, carefully planned vacations. I was always the one everyone relied on to remember birthdays, to check in when someone was going through a rough patch, to organize the holiday gift exchange. I built my identity around being needed, being dependable, being the emotional ballast for everyone around me. And through it all, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt everything. But at such a distance, it might as well have been happening to someone else. Joy, grief, love, anger, all of it registered as muted echoes, experienced through a thick fog of disconnection. I knew intellectually when I should feel happy or sad, and I performed those emotions convincingly. But I couldn't access them directly. They remained locked in a vault I'd lost the key to years ago. The most painful part was that I didn't even recognize this as abnormal. I assumed everyone experienced life this way, going through the motions, playing their assigned roles, feeling emotions as abstract concepts rather than lived experiences. I thought the people who seemed genuinely happy, or genuinely anything, were just better actors than I was. The possibility that they were actually feeling what they expressed never occurred to me. Then came the decision to have a child. My spouse was eager to start a family. I agreed because it seemed like the natural progression, the next scene in the play of our lives. I approached pregnancy and childbirth with the same detached efficiency I brought to everything else, researching optimal nutrition, attending all recommended checkups, preparing the nursery with methodical care. When friends asked if I was excited, I smiled and nodded, mimicking the enthusiasm I saw in other expectant mothers. The birth of our daughter should have been transformative, and in many ways it was, just not in the ways I'd been led to expect. As I held her tiny body against my chest for the first time, I waited for the overwhelming rush of love everyone had promised. Instead, I felt a curious blend of responsibility and fear. This tiny human needed me in ways no one ever had before. There would be no room for error in this new role. The performance would have to be perfect. And for the first few years, it was. I was, by all objective measures, an excellent mother. I met my daughter's physical needs meticulously. I read to her daily, engaged her in developmentally appropriate activities, ensured she ate nutritious meals, and maintained a consistent sleep schedule. I documented her milestones, celebrated her achievements, comforted her when she was hurt or scared. I loved her, of course I did, but through that same fog that filtered all my emotional experiences. I thought this was sustainable. I really did. I believed I could continue this elaborate performance indefinitely, that my daughter would never notice the hollowness beneath my maternal facade. But children have a way of seeing through pretense. They haven't yet learned to accept the social scripts adults hide behind. And as my daughter grew from toddler to preschooler, she began to ask questions I wasn't prepared for. "Mommy, are you sad?" she asked once, studying my face with those searching eyes. "No, sweetie, why would you think that?" I replied, manufacturing a smile. "Your eyes don't match your mouth when you smile," she said simply, before returning to her toys. Her observation haunted me for days. What else could she see that I thought I was hiding? What damage was I doing to her with my emotional dishonesty? Children learn how to be human by watching the adults around them. What kind of template was I providing? These questions opened the first crack in the edifice I'd spent my life constructing. But it would take something more to bring it crashing down entirely. The breakdown didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a slow, inexorable crumbling, the way water gradually erodes stone, creating fissures too small to notice until suddenly the whole structure gives way. It began with dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams that left me gasping awake in the pre-dawn darkness, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. Dreams of being trapped, of running from unseen pursuers, of trying to scream but producing no sound. Dreams where I was simultaneously a child and an adult, both desperately afraid and unnaturally calm. I'd never been prone to nightmares before. I'd always been a sound sleeper, another point of pride in my catalog of perfect functions. My spouse began to notice, of course. They'd wake beside me, concerned, offering comfort I couldn't accept because I couldn't explain what was happening. How could I describe the terror when I didn't understand it myself? Then came the physical symptoms, headaches that lingered for days, stomach pains that defied diagnosis, a persistent tightness in my chest that sometimes made it difficult to breathe. My doctor found nothing wrong. "It might be stress," she suggested gently. "Have there been any significant changes in your life recently?" I shook my head. Everything was fine. Everything was always fine. That was the foundation of my identity. But it wasn't fine. The fractures were spreading, becoming visible. I began to make small mistakes at work, missing deadlines, forgetting important details, zoning out during meetings. My typically impeccable memory became unreliable. I'd find myself standing in rooms with no recollection of why I'd entered them, driving familiar routes only to realize I'd passed my destination, starting sentences I couldn't finish because the words evaporated from my mind mid-thought. At home, my patience, once seemingly infinite, grew thin. Small irritations that I would normally absorb without comment began to grate unbearably. My daughter's innocent questions felt like interrogations. My spouse's attempts at connection registered as demands I couldn't meet. I began to withdraw, spending more time alone, claiming work pressures or headaches when anyone asked if something was wrong. "I'm just tired," became my mantra. And I was tired, exhausted in a bone-deep way that no amount of sleep could touch. But it wasn't physical fatigue draining me. It was the unsustainable effort of maintaining my performance while the stage beneath me was collapsing. The pivotal moment came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. My daughter, then 5 years old, was working on a kindergarten assignment about families. She had to draw pictures of what made each family member happy and sad and angry and scared. She completed the sections for herself and her other parent easily, but sat staring at the blank space under my name with growing frustration. "Mommy, what makes you sad?" she asked. Such a simple question. Children ask these things every day. But in that moment, it was as if she'd touched a live wire inside me. "I don't know," I said, the words escaping before I could capture them and replace them with an appropriate answer. My daughter looked up, confused. "Everyone gets sad sometimes," she insisted. "Teacher says it's important to know what makes us feel things." "Your teacher is right," I managed. "I just need to think about it." But I couldn't think. My mind had gone completely blank, a static buzz filling my head. What did make me sad? What made me happy? What made me anything? I realized with sudden, horrifying clarity that I had no idea how to answer these most basic questions about myself. I excused myself, walked calmly to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub, my entire body trembling. Something was rising within me. A pressure, a force I couldn't identify or control. It felt as if I might fly apart into 1,000 pieces if I moved too suddenly. That night, after my daughter was asleep, my spouse found me still sitting in the bathroom, in the same position, hours later. "What's going on?" they asked, kneeling beside me, their face etched with concern. "Talk to me. Please." I opened my mouth to reassure them, to offer some plausible explanation that would allow us both to pretend everything was normal. But what emerged instead was a sound I'd never heard myself make before. Raw, primal, torn from somewhere deep inside. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream. Once it started, I couldn't stop it. My spouse held me as I shook with the force of this strange keening, murmuring reassurances I couldn't process. When the storm finally passed, leaving me empty and hollow-eyed, they helped me to bed, tucking the covers around me as if I were the child. "Whatever it is," they whispered, "we'll figure it out together." But how could we figure out something I couldn't name? How could I explain that I was grieving for a self I'd never allowed to exist? That I was terrified of what might remain if I stopped performing the roles that defined me? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in years. Then the next day, and the day after that. I moved through our home like a ghost, going through the motions of everyday life while feeling increasingly detached from reality. My spouse took over, caring for our daughter, making excuses for my strange behavior that neither of us believed. "Mommy's not feeling well," I heard them explain. "Sometimes people need quiet time to get better." But I wasn't getting better. I was unraveling, years of suppressed emotions resurging with volcanic force. I'd cry without warning, laugh inappropriately, stare into space for hours. Sleep became either impossible or all I wanted to do. Food lost all taste. The world seemed simultaneously too loud, too bright, too much, and completely unreachable, as if I were observing everything from behind thick glass. My spouse suggested therapy. Actually, suggested is too mild a word. They insisted, made the appointment themselves, drove me there when it became clear I wasn't capable of taking that step alone. I sat in the therapist's comfortable office, surrounded by carefully chosen calming colors and textures, and said nothing for the entire session. The second session went much the same way. And the third. The therapist was patient, offering gentle prompts, creating space for words I couldn't find. By the fourth session, something shifted. Not dramatically. I didn't suddenly pour out my life story in a cathartic flood. But I managed to articulate one truth. "I don't know who I am," I said, the words barely audible. The therapist nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "That's a difficult place to be," she acknowledged. "But it's somewhere to start." And so began the slow, excruciating process of excavation, digging through layers of performance and pretense to find whatever lay beneath. Each session felt like peeling away another layer of skin, leaving me raw and exposed. I resisted, of course. There's safety in the familiar, even when the familiar is killing you. I wanted to retreat back into numbness, back into the roles I'd perfected. But there was no going back. The fracture had happened. All I could do now was try to survive the breaking. Memory is a curious thing. We think of it as reliable, a faithful record of our past, but it's more like a story we tell ourselves, constantly being edited and revised to fit our current understanding of who we are. And some chapters of that story are too painful to include in the narrative, so we tuck them away, out of sight but never truly gone. In my 8th therapy session, the therapist asked about my childhood. I gave the sanitized version I'd always presented: loving but busy parents, comfortable home, normal ups and downs. She listened carefully, then asked a question that seemed innocuous. "What's your earliest memory of feeling safe?" I opened my mouth to answer and found I had nothing to say. The question echoed in my mind, ricocheting off walls I hadn't known existed. Safe? Had I ever felt safe? What did safety even feel like? Something shifted in that moment. A door unlocking, a curtain pulling back to reveal a scene I'd spent a lifetime trying not to see. Suddenly I was no longer in the therapist's office but back in my childhood home. 6 years old, hiding in my bedroom closet, knees pulled tight to my chest, listening to the muffled sounds of my parents' argument escalating below. This wasn't a new memory. I'd always known my parents argued, sometimes intensely. What was new was experiencing it again through my child self's body, the racing heart, the shallow breathing, the absolute conviction that somehow their anger was my fault, that I needed to be smaller, quieter, better to keep the peace. More memories surfaced in quick succession, no longer held at the sanitized distance I'd maintained for decades. The time my mother didn't speak to me for 3 days because I'd broken an heirloom vase. The way my father would retreat into stony silence when disappointed, his withdrawal more devastating than any punishment. The constant, anxious vigilance of monitoring the emotional temperature of our home, adjusting my behavior accordingly. None of this constituted what most people would call abuse. There was no physical violence, no overt cruelty. Just a persistent emotional neglect, an unspoken demand that I manage my parents' emotions by suppressing my own. I learned early that my feelings were inconvenient at best, dangerous at worst. When the memories finally subsided, I found myself curled in the therapist's armchair, tears streaming down my face. She handed me a box of tissues, with a gentleness that nearly undid me again. "That looked like a difficult journey," she said simply. I nodded, unable to speak. "Would you like to share any part of it?" And surprisingly, I did. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush I couldn't control. I told her about the closet, about the vase, about 100 small moments of feeling utterly alone with emotions too big for a child to process. I told her how I'd learned to compartmentalize, to perform, to become whoever I needed to be to maintain the fragile peace of our household. I never thought of it as traumatic, I admitted. It was just normal. It was all I knew. "That's often how childhood trauma works," she explained. "When it's chronic rather than acute, when it's about what's missing rather than what happened, we don't recognize it as trauma. But the impact is just as real." That session marked a turning point. Having opened the door to those memories, I couldn't close it again. They came in waves, sometimes during therapy, sometimes in the middle of ordinary moments at home or work. Each recollection brought with it the emotions I hadn't been allowed to feel at the time. Grief, rage, terror, helplessness. Emotions that had been locked away for so long. They emerged with the intensity of a dam breaking. I took a leave of absence from work. There was no way I could maintain my professional facade while undergoing this internal earthquake. My spouse stepped up in ways I couldn't have anticipated, managing our household, caring for our daughter, creating space for my messy, painful process without demanding explanations I wasn't ready to give. The hardest part wasn't remembering the past. It was recognizing how completely those early experiences had shaped my present. I saw with devastating clarity how I'd built my entire adult life around avoiding the vulnerability I'd learned was dangerous. How I'd chosen a career, friendships, even my marriage based not on what I wanted, but on what felt safe, what wouldn't trigger the feelings of abandonment and unworthiness that lurked just beneath my carefully constructed persona. Most painful of all was realizing how I'd been repeating patterns with my own daughter. Not in the same way. I'd never been emotionally distant with her the way my parents had been with me. But in my determination to be a perfect mother, to always be calm and patient and in control, I'd been teaching her the same lesson I'd learned. That certain emotions are unacceptable. That perfect performance is the price of love. One evening, about 3 months into this process of remembering, I was sitting on our back porch, watching the sunset. My daughter came out and climbed into my lap without a word, something she hadn't done in weeks. I'd been so absorbed in my own healing process, I hadn't noticed how carefully she'd been moving around me, as if afraid I might shatter at any moment. "Are you still sick, Mommy?" she asked, her small hand patting my cheek with such tender concern I nearly wept. I considered how to answer. The old me would have reassured her immediately, denied any problem, maintained the illusion that mothers don't break. But I was learning painfully that honesty might be the greatest gift I could give her, and myself. "I'm not sick exactly," I said slowly. "I'm sad about some things that happened a long time ago, things I didn't let myself be sad about before. And sometimes when we finally let ourselves feel sad about old hurts, it can look a lot like being sick." She nodded, accepting this with the straightforward wisdom of children. "When I feel sad, hugs help," she offered. "They help me too," I said, holding her close, allowing myself to fully feel the love that had always been there, but that I'd experienced through that numbing fog. Later that night, I found my spouse in our bedroom, folding laundry, another task they'd taken on during my collapse. "I need to tell you something," I said, the words sticking in my throat. "Actually, I need to tell you everything." They set down the half-folded shirt, giving me their full attention. "I'm listening." And so began the hardest conversation of my life, harder even than the excavations in therapy, because this was the person I'd promised to love and honor, the person who thought they knew me. I told them about my childhood, about the emotional fortress I'd built in response, about how much of our relationship had been filtered through my need to perform rather than to genuinely connect. "I feel like I've been lying to you from the beginning," I finished, my voice raw. "Not about loving you, that part has always been real, even if I experienced it through this protective numbness, but about who I am. The truth is, I don't know who I am without all these roles I've been playing, and I'm terrified that when I figure it out, you won't love that person." I expected anger, betrayal, perhaps even an immediate desire to end our marriage. What I didn't expect was the profound compassion in their eyes. "I've always known there were parts of you that you kept locked away," they said quietly. "I didn't know why, and I didn't know how to reach them. But I fell in love with you, not just the parts you felt safe showing me. All of you, including the parts you're just now discovering yourself." Their acceptance broke something open in me, the final wall separating me from my own emotions. For the first time in my adult life, maybe in my entire life, I allowed myself to be fully seen in all my broken, unfinished humanity. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, I felt something I'd been chasing my entire life without realizing it. I felt real. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't follow a neat narrative arc from brokenness to wholeness. It's messy, circular, frustrating. You make progress, then regress, then inch forward again. Some days you feel like you've finally broken through to solid ground. Others, you're back in the abyss. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things do change. In the year that followed my breakdown, I learned to inhabit my body again, to recognize hunger and fatigue and desire as physical sensations rather than abstract concepts. I learned to identify emotions as they arose, rather than suppressing them or performing what I thought was expected. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to fix or escape it. None of this came naturally. After decades of disconnection, reconnecting was painful, often overwhelming work. There were days when I longed for the numbing fog, when feeling everything seemed unbearable. There were nights when I lay awake, terrified by the enormity of what I was attempting. Not just healing old wounds, but essentially creating a self from scratch at 40 years old. But there were also moments of unexpected joy, of connection so pure and unfiltered it took my breath away. The first time I laughed, truly laughed, not the polite chuckle I'd perfected. My daughter stared at me in wonder before dissolving into giggles herself. The first time I expressed anger directly rather than burying it beneath a veneer of calm rationality. My spouse held space for my rage without trying to diminish or resolve it. The first time I admitted I didn't have an answer, didn't have a plan, couldn't be the one holding everything together, and the world didn't end. 6 months after beginning therapy, I returned to work. Not to the same position I'd left, with its high pressure and constant demand for perfection, but to a part-time role that allowed space for my continuing healing. My colleagues were understandably curious about my absence, but I developed a simple explanation that was both true and appropriately boundary. I had some health issues I needed to address, I would say. I'm doing much better now, but I'm being intentional about maintaining balance. Some accepted this at face value. Others clearly wondered about the details but respected my privacy. A few shared their own experiences with burnout or mental health challenges, creating unexpected connections where before there had been only professional courtesy. At home, my relationship with my spouse entered uncharted territory. We were in many ways getting to know each other for the first time, or rather, I was allowing myself to be known in ways I never had before. This brought both intimacy and conflict. Arguments that once would have sent me retreating behind a wall of people-pleasing accommodation now became opportunities for genuine expression and resolution. "I don't even know how to fight with you," my spouse admitted after one particularly heated exchange. "You used to just agree with whatever I wanted." "I used to think keeping the peace was more important than being authentic," I acknowledged. "I'm still figuring out how to do this." We were both learning how to disagree without withdrawing, how to be honest without being hurtful, how to maintain connection even in the midst of conflict. It wasn't always graceful, but it was real in a way our relationship had never been before. The most profound transformation, though, was in my relationship with my daughter. As I became more emotionally present and honest, she blossomed in ways that made me realize how much my performance of perfect motherhood had constrained her. She became more expressive, more comfortable with her own range of emotions, more willing to make mistakes and try again. One afternoon, she knocked over a glass of juice at dinner, the kind of minor accident that happens in every household. Before my breakdown, I would have immediately reassured her it was fine, cleaned up the mess efficiently, and moved on, all while maintaining perfect composure. But on this day, I felt a flash of irritation. Nothing major, just the normal response to an interruption and extra work. Rather than hiding this reaction, I let her see it. "I'm feeling a little frustrated right now," I said as I reached for a towel. "That's creating more work when I'm already tired." But it was an accident, and accidents happen. "My feeling will pass quickly." She watched me mop up the spill, then asked, "Are you mad at me?" "I'm not mad at you," I clarified. "I'm just having a feeling about what happened." You can be frustrated by a situation without being angry at a person. It was such a small moment, but it represented everything I was trying to unlearn and relearn. That emotions don't have to be hidden to be manageable. That expressing frustration doesn't equal rejection. That authenticity creates safety rather than threatening. Therapy continued, evolving from crisis intervention to deeper work on rebuilding my sense of self. I began to explore questions I'd never dared ask before. What did I actually enjoy? What values were genuinely mine, not inherited or adopted for approval? What kind of life did I want to create now that performance was no longer my primary goal? The answers didn't come easily or all at once. They emerged gradually through experimentation, through paying attention to what energized rather than depleted me, through noticing when I felt aligned versus when I was falling back in old patterns of people-pleasing. I discovered I loved poetry, not analyzing it academically as I'd done in school, but experiencing it viscerally, letting the words resonate in my body. I found I had strong political convictions that I'd suppressed to maintain harmony in social settings. I realized I was drawn to creative expression despite having convinced myself I had no artistic talent. Some discoveries were uncomfortable. I had to face my tendency toward perfectionism, my fear of judgment, my deep-seated belief that I had to earn love through usefulness. I had to recognize how these patterns had shaped my choices and limited my life. Other revelations were liberating. I didn't actually enjoy many of the social obligations I'd always fulfilled without question. I preferred deep conversations with a few close friends to large gatherings. I loved being in nature more than any urban environment, despite having built my life around city conveniences. Slowly, I began making changes to align my external reality with my emerging internal truth. Some were small, declining invitations I would previously have accepted out of obligation, expressing preferences about restaurants or activities, rather than always deferring to others. Some were more significant, renegotiating responsibilities in my marriage, setting boundaries with extended family, reconsidering career directions. Not everyone in my life welcomed these changes. My parents, in particular, were confused and sometimes hurt by my new boundaries and increased emotional honesty. Friends who had counted on my unfailing agreeableness found themselves unsure how to relate to this more authentic version of me. A few relationships didn't survive the transition. but others deepened in ways I could never have imagined. My spouse and I developed an intimacy based on genuine knowing, rather than comfortable routine. Certain friendships evolved from pleasant social connections to meaningful bonds built on mutual vulnerability. And most importantly, I began to develop a relationship with myself, not the idealized self I'd always strived to be, but the messy, contradictory, fully human person I actually was. About a year and a half after my breakdown, my therapist suggested we reduce our sessions from weekly to bi-weekly. I felt both proud of this milestone and terrified of losing the support that had become so crucial to my healing. "You've done remarkable work," she told me. "Not just processing your trauma, but building a whole new relationship with yourself. That doesn't mean the work is finished. This kind of growth continues throughout life. But you have the tools now to continue that growth outside this room." I wasn't sure I believed her. There were still days when the old numbness threatened to descend, when performing seemed easier than the vulnerable work of authentic living. There were still moments when I caught myself slipping into people-pleasing patterns, when I abandoned my needs to keep others comfortable. But there were also days, more and more of them, when I felt fully present in my body and my life, when I experienced emotions directly rather than at a remove, when I made choices based on internal values rather than external expectations. There were moments of genuine connection with my spouse, my daughter, my friends that would have been impossible before. And there was something else, something I'd never anticipated when I began this journey of healing. There was forgiveness for my parents, who had done the best they could with their own unhealed wounds, for my spouse, who had unknowingly participated in my performance, for myself, the child who had found the only way she could to survive an emotionally barren landscape, and the adult who had maintained those patterns long after they were necessary. This forgiveness didn't come as a dramatic epiphany. Like everything in the healing process, it emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day I realized the bitter weight of resentment had lifted, leaving space for something gentler and more nuanced to take its place. On my daughter's 7th birthday, 2 years after the kindergarten assignment that had triggered my breakdown, we hosted a small celebration at our home. Nothing elaborate, just a few of her friends. Homemade cake, simple games in the backyard. The kind of gathering I would once have approached as another performance to perfect, another opportunity to prove my worth through flawless execution. Instead, I found myself fully present, laughing genuinely at the children's antics, enjoying conversations with the other parents without constant self-monitoring, accepting help when offered rather than insisting I could manage everything myself. When the cake I'd baked came out slightly lopsided, I felt a moment of my old perfectionism arise, and then, remarkably, subside. That evening, after the guests had gone and my daughter was in bed, my spouse found me sitting quietly on the back porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You seemed happy today," they observed, settling into the chair beside me. "Not just doing what needs to be done happy, but actually happy." I considered this. I realized. Not every moment. I was stressed when the ice cream started melting before we could serve it, and I got annoyed when the piñata wouldn't break. But mostly, yes, I was happy. "What's different?" they asked. "Between now and before?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Before, I was always performing happiness," I said finally. I knew exactly what it was supposed to look like, what facial expressions to make, what tone of voice to use, what things to say. I could convince anyone I was happy, maybe even myself sometimes. But it was always at a distance, like watching happiness through a window rather than feeling it directly. I turned to look at them, this person who had stood by me through the messiest, most painful transformation of my life. Today I wasn't performing anything. I was just here, experiencing everything directly, the joy and the stress and the irritation. All of it. And it turns out that's what happiness actually is, not the absence of negative emotions, but the freedom to experience the full range without judgment or fear. My spouse reached over and took my hand, their touch grounding me in the present moment. We sat in companionable silence as night fully descended. The weight of everything unsaid between us for so many years finally lifted. I don't know what the future holds. I'm still learning who I am beyond the roles I've played, still discovering what I want from this one precious life. There are still days when the old patterns reassert themselves, when trauma responses override my best intentions, when the vastness of authentic living feels overwhelming. But I'm no longer hiding, no longer performing, no longer sacrificing my truth for the comfort of others or the illusion of safety. After a lifetime of silence, I have finally found my voice, not just the words I speak aloud, but the quiet, steady voice within that guides me toward wholeness. And in that voice I have found the person I was always meant to be.